The studio lights burned with an unnatural brightness, illuminating every wrinkle, every bead of sweat, every shift in expression on the faces of those seated on the plush chairs of the broadcast set. The air hummed with barely contained tension, a charged current running beneath the surface of what had been advertised as just another evening political segment. But the audience could feel it. This was no ordinary interview. Donald Trump sat at the center of the stage, his broad shoulders squared, his familiar orange-toned complexion set against the cool blue hues of the set design. He had done 1,000 of these before. Nothing new. The same routine, the same predictable jabs from journalists desperate for a viral moment. The same chance for him to turn the attack back onto them with a smirk and a quip that would dominate the news cycle by morning. But something was different tonight. There was a sharpness to the atmosphere, a sense of impending impact, like the pregnant pause before a lightning strike. Across from him sat Thomas Caldwell, a liberal journalist who had built his career on exposing hypocrisy, wielding his words like scalpels to dissect the polished facades of the powerful. His sharp eyes glimmered with anticipation. His lips curled in the subtle ghost of a smile as he leaned forward in his chair. There was something almost predatory about his posture, casual but coiled, like a panther lying in wait. The segment had begun predictably enough. Caldwell's initial line of questioning had been routine, touching on policy failures, recent controversies, and Trump's ever-divisive influence on the political landscape. Trump had handled it in the way he always did, deflecting with bravado, laughing off-pointed accusations, countering with his signature blend of humor and calculated aggression. The audience had laughed when he scoffed at media bias, had nodded approvingly when he pointed out the hypocrisy of Washington insiders pretending to be righteous. But then the tone shifted. Caldwell leaned forward, resting his elbows on the desk between them, his fingers tapping lightly as he cocked his head in a way that was almost playful. The pause was deliberate, stretching just long enough to make the tension palpable. Trump's instinct, honed from decades in the public eye, sensed the shift. His expression flickered, just for a fraction of a second, but that was all Caldwell needed. He had found the opening, and he wasn't going to let it go to waste. "Mr. Trump," Caldwell began, his voice smooth but laced with an edge, "we've talked about your legacy, your policies, your influence. But let's talk about something more personal. Let's talk about your marriage." A ripple passed through the audience, barely perceptible but undeniably there. A few reporters seated in the press section exchanged knowing glances. Trump's face remained composed, but the subtle tightening of his jaw did not go unnoticed. The very air in the studio seemed to grow heavier. "I think America deserves to know," Caldwell continued, his voice calm, almost too calm. "How much of the image you've so carefully cultivated is real, and how much is just a well-rehearsed performance?" A murmur ran through the audience. The producers in the control room exchanged quick, nervous glances, their fingers hovering over switches, ready to cut to commercial if things spiraled too far. For the first time that evening, Trump didn't immediately respond. It was only the briefest of hesitations, a fraction of a second, but it was enough. Caldwell had drawn blood. "You see, Mr. Trump," Caldwell pressed on, "you've built your career on perception. The powerful businessman, the devoted family man, the unshakable leader. But what happens when that perception crumbles? When the truth slips through the cracks?" The studio was silent now, save for the faint hum of the overhead lights. Caldwell let the moment breathe, savoring the suspense before delivering the final, calculated blow. "You talk about loyalty," he said, tilting his head slightly, his voice dropping just enough to make the moment feel almost intimate, like a secret being unveiled. "But sources close to your family say that behind closed doors, things aren't quite what they seem. That Melania has been absent from more than just public events. That she's been absent from you." The words hung in the air, heavy, oppressive. The weight of them pressed down on the room, on the audience, on Trump himself. For the first time, the carefully crafted illusion cracked, and the world was about to see what lay beneath. The air in the studio had shifted from tense anticipation to something heavier, something far more suffocating. The moment Caldwell's words settled, A hush fell over the room, not the polite silence of an engaged audience, but the kind that accompanied a brewing storm, the kind that signaled an irreversible shift in the atmosphere. It was as if the air had thickened, as if every single person in the room was holding their breath, waiting to see what would happen next. Donald Trump, a man who prided himself on never appearing shaken, on always holding the upper hand in any confrontation, sat unnaturally still. His expression, so often a mask of smug confidence, had stiffened ever so slightly, his normally animated features momentarily frozen in place. But for those who had studied him, who had watched him maneuver through thousands of interviews, it was clear Caldwell had struck a nerve. In the control room, producers whispered frantically, fingers hovering over the control board, ready to intervene if the situation spiraled too far. The network had expected drama, had anticipated strong rhetoric and a heated exchange, but no one had prepared for this, for a question that peeled back the polished veneer of invincibility and exposed something raw, something real. Caldwell did not press further, did not rush to fill the silence with additional jabs or explanations. He knew better. He understood that sometimes the absence of words was more powerful than any carefully crafted attack. The journalist leaned back in his chair, tilting his head slightly, his expression unreadable, his confidence unwavering. He was not seeking an outburst. He was waiting for the unraveling. Trump's fingers, resting on the armrest of his chair, twitched almost imperceptibly, a reflex he likely wasn't even aware of. The overhead lights, always harsh, seemed even brighter now, casting shadows that made the deep lines in his face appear even more pronounced. He blinked once, then twice, the kind of blink that came not from fatigue, but from the effort of processing an unexpected turn, from the realization that he was standing on the edge of a precipice with no clear way back. The audience, still frozen in place, absorbed every detail, their collective focus locked onto the man who had built an empire on control. Control of the narrative, control of perception, control of how the world saw him. But control, once lost, was nearly impossible to regain. A single second stretched into an eternity before Trump finally moved. He shifted slightly in his chair, adjusting his posture with a deliberate slowness that was meant to convey composure, but instead revealed the struggle beneath the surface. When he finally spoke, his voice carried its usual force, but the edges were not as sharp, the confidence not as absolute. "Fake news," he said, his signature phrase meant to dismiss, to disarm, to erase any credibility from the attack before it could take root. But something about it rang hollow. Something about the way he said it lacked the effortless bravado that usually accompanied his deflections. Caldwell did not flinch, did not so much as blink. He simply allowed the moment to breathe. Let the weight of it settle. Let the audience absorb the growing disconnect between the accusation and the response. "With all due respect, Mr. Trump," Caldwell said finally, his voice smooth, measured, "this isn't about the media's narrative or political bias. This is about truth." The word truth landed like a stone in the middle of a still pond, its impact sending ripples through the room. A few members of the live audience shifted in their seats, the kind of restless movement that betrayed discomfort, the kind that suggested they, too, had been caught off guard by the moment's gravity. Trump exhaled, a sharp breath through his nose, his jaw tightening just slightly. He had spent decades mastering the art of deflection, had built an entire persona on the foundation of turning attacks back onto his opponents. But this was different. This was not an argument about policies or polls, not a debate over rhetoric or party lines. This was personal. He leaned forward, planting his elbows on the armrests, his fingers intertwining in a gesture meant to signal control. His eyes, sharp and calculating, locked onto Caldwell's with renewed intensity. And for a moment, it seemed as though he was about to launch into a counterattack, to wrestle the conversation back in a territory he could navigate with ease. But something held him back. Perhaps it was the knowledge that denying too forcefully would only fuel the fire. Perhaps it was the awareness that even those who supported him, those who had stood by him through scandals and controversies, would see through an unconvincing dismissal. Or perhaps, just perhaps, it was the understanding that for the first time in a very long time, he was not in control of how this story unfolded. The silence stretched again, each passing second adding to the weight pressing down on the room. Caldwell, ever the tactician, remained still, his expression betraying nothing, his patience unwavering. He was waiting for the unraveling. And then something shifted. Trump's posture, once rigid, relaxed slightly, but not in a way that suggested ease. It was something closer to resignation, the kind of forced composure that comes when a man realizes he is walking a tightrope with no safety net beneath him. His fingers, still intertwined, tightened briefly before he spoke again. "You know," he said, his voice lower now, quieter. "People like you always think you know everything. Think you can spin whatever story you want, make it sound like fact." A murmur ran through the audience, a ripple of intrigue rather than agreement. Caldwell's brow lifted just slightly, a nearly imperceptible flicker of amusement flashing across his features. But he said nothing. He let Trump continue. "My marriage, my family, my personal life, none of that is your business," Trump went on, his voice gaining strength now, his tone taking on a familiar edge. "People love to speculate, love to pretend they know what happens behind closed doors, love to create stories where there are none." Caldwell nodded slightly, as if considering the words, as if carefully weighing his next move. He knew he had pulled back the curtain, even if only slightly, had forced Trump to acknowledge the crack in the carefully constructed image. But the game was not over yet. Trump exhaled sharply, as if attempting to shake off the moment, to reset the tone of the interview, to shift the power balance back in his favor. But the audience could see it now, could sense the energy that had shifted irreversibly. Caldwell let a beat of silence pass before speaking again, his voice as composed as ever. "Mr. Trump," he said slowly, his gaze steady, "perception can only hold for so long before reality catches up." The words landed like a thunderclap. Trump's jaw clenched. The audience, now fully aware that they were witnessing something rare, something raw, barely moved. And Caldwell, sensing that the final unraveling was just beginning, leaned forward ever so slightly, the glint in his eye revealing that he was far from finished. The weight of Caldwell's final words settled over the studio like a thick fog, dense and inescapable. The audience, once lulled into passive observation by the usual political banter, was now wide-eyed, locked onto the scene unfolding before them. They had come expecting the familiar dance of calculated rhetoric and fiery exchanges, but instead, they found themselves witnessing something far more uncomfortable, something raw, something dangerously real. Trump sat rigid in his chair, his fingers pressed tightly together, the knuckles white from the pressure. He was a man who thrived on control, who had built an empire on the strength of his ability to dictate the narrative, to bend perception to his will. But this was different. This wasn't just another debate, another verbal joust where he could overpower his opponent with sheer force of personality. This was an invasion, an exposure, a moment where the walls he had so carefully constructed around his personal life were being pried open, brick by brick. Caldwell did not move, did not flinch under the weight of Trump's glare. He remained perfectly composed, his eyes unwavering, his posture unchanged. He knew he had forced his opponent into unfamiliar terrain, had pulled him into waters where his usual tactics would not serve him. There was no easy out here, no quick redirection to a safer topic. The truth had been placed squarely in the center of the conversation, and no amount of bluster could make it disappear. The silence stretched painfully, an oppressive pause that felt far longer than it was. Every person in the room could feel it, the unraveling that was beginning to take hold. Trump's face, though still firm, betrayed the subtle shifts of a man battling between restraint and instinct. His lips pressed together, his jaw clenched tighter, the vein at his temple pulsing in rhythm with his rising frustration. He was trapped, cornered in a way that few had ever managed to achieve. Finally, with a slow exhale, He shifted in his seat, his hands unfolding, his fingers drumming against the armrest in a restless rhythm. His eyes, sharp and calculating, locked onto Caldwell's with a fire that had been subdued but not extinguished. He would not let himself be humiliated. Not here, not in front of millions. "You know," Trump said finally, his voice lower, rougher, each word laced with barely restrained anger. "People like you love this, don't you? You love taking personal matters, twisting them into some grand spectacle, acting like you're revealing some great secret." His tone carried its usual bravado, but something was missing. The effortless dominance, the unshakable certainty that had always been his trademark. It was as if, for the first time, he was speaking not to control the room, but to convince himself that he still had control at all. Caldwell remained unmoved, his expression unreadable. He let the words settle before leaning in just slightly, his voice deliberate, slow, unyielding. "Mr. Trump, no one twisted anything," he said, each syllable measured with precision. "The only thing being revealed here is reality." Another murmur rippled through the audience, a quiet, collective recognition that the balance of power in the room had shifted in a way no one had anticipated. The cameras captured every flicker of emotion, every micro-expression, every crack in the armor that Trump had spent years perfecting. His nostrils flared slightly, his fingers gripping the chair as he fought to suppress the reaction surging within him. He wanted to lash out, to take back control, to turn the tables with a single, cutting remark. But for once, the words did not come easily. He knew, deep down, that the more he fought this, the more fuel he would add to the fire. He had spent a lifetime defying expectations, bulldozing through scandals, surviving where others would have crumbled. But this wasn't about policy, wasn't about business, wasn't about political maneuvering. This was about something far more fragile, something that could not be salvaged with a press conference or a strategic statement. His marriage had always been a subject of speculation, whispered about in the halls of media power, dissected in tabloids, analyzed by those who sought to understand the enigma of Melania Trump. She had been distant, absent from key appearances, her presence growing increasingly rare. And now, the world was seeing the cracks that he had desperately tried to keep hidden. He exhaled sharply, the sound barely audible over the tense silence of the studio. His eyes flicked toward the audience, scanning the faces watching him, some with barely concealed satisfaction, others with something closer to pity. He despised that look. Pity was for the weak, for those who had lost, for those who had been defeated. And Donald Trump had never been defeated. His chest rose and fell with controlled breaths, his fingers still tapping against the chair, his mind racing for an escape. He had weathered worse storms. He had been underestimated before. He would not let this be the moment that defined him. Straightening his posture, he forced a smirk, a shadow of his usual arrogance creeping back into his features. He turned his gaze back to Caldwell, tilting his head ever so slightly, the ghost of amusement flickering behind his eyes. "You know what's funny?" Trump said, his voice regaining some of its previous rhythm. "People have been writing my obituary for years, acting like one little headline is going to bring me down." Caldwell remained silent, waiting, watching, refusing to give him an easy way out. Trump chuckled, the sound sharp, almost forced. "But here's the thing," he continued, his voice dripping with defiance. "I don't break. I don't crumble. You think you've got me cornered? Think you've exposed something that's going to shake me?" He leaned forward now, mirroring Caldwell's posture, his eyes narrowing. "You don't know a damn thing." The words hung in the air, a direct challenge, a final attempt to claw back the upper hand. But something had shifted irreversibly. The audience could feel it. The tension had not been erased. It had simply changed form, no longer a battle of dominance, but a quiet acknowledgement that something had been lost. Caldwell did not respond right away. He let the moment linger, let Trump's words sit between them, unchallenged but not victorious. He could have pressed further, could have delivered the final blow. But instead, he simply offered a small, knowing smile. "This was never about breaking you, Mr. Trump," he said finally, his voice calm, almost gentle. It's about showing the world what happens when the truth catches up. For the first time, Trump had no response. The cameras captured it all. The flicker of uncertainty in his eyes, the barely concealed tension in his clenched jaw, the uncharacteristic stillness of a man who had always thrived on motion, on momentum, on the ability to dictate the flow of conversation. And then, just as quickly as it had begun, the segment was over. The lights dimmed slightly as the host signaled for a commercial break. The spell of the moment breaking just enough for the audience to release the breaths they hadn't realized they had been holding. But the energy in the room did not dissipate. It lingered, thick and unshakable, the echoes of an unraveling that could not be undone. Trump exhaled, pushing himself up from his chair, straightening his suit with a practiced movement. He said nothing as he turned away from the cameras, nothing as he strode toward the exit with a controlled, deliberate pace. But even as he walked away, he knew the story was already out, and no amount of control could take it back. The heavy doors of the studio swung shut behind Donald Trump, their metallic echo reverberating through the dimly lit backstage hallway. Outside, the crowd remained locked in hushed conversation, their voices merging into an indistinct hum, the kind of restless murmur that always followed the unraveling of something too large to ignore. The flashing red on air sign had darkened, but the weight of what had just unfolded on live television was still thick in the air, clinging to every surface, stretching its reach far beyond the walls of the studio. Trump walked with measured steps, his polished shoes striking the floor in a steady rhythm that betrayed none of the turmoil simmering beneath his composed exterior. His hands, however, betrayed him, fingers twitching slightly at his sides, clenching and unclenching with a restless energy he had not yet mastered. He had expected a fight. He had even welcomed the idea of a confrontation, a chance to do what he did best: turn attack into an opportunity, transform scrutiny into spectacle. But this had been different. This had been personal. His security detail trailed him at a respectful distance, their presence familiar but offering no comfort. He could hear their boots against the tile, could feel the weight of their unspoken questions pressing into the space between them. But no one dared break the silence. They all knew better than to speak when the storm was still gathering, when the air was still thick with the kind of tension that could ignite into something explosive at any moment. The producer, a woman whose professionalism had been carefully sculpted over decades in the industry, approached cautiously, her clipboard clutched tightly against her chest. She had seen men in power walk off sets before, had witnessed every variation of anger, indignation, and frustration that could unfold after a tough interview. But this was something else. This wasn't anger for the cameras, wasn't the calculated outrage that some politicians performed to rally their base. This was real. "Mr. Trump," she said, her voice careful, as if testing the temperature of the room, "your car is waiting out back. Would you like a few moments before addressing the press?" Trump did not slow his pace, did not acknowledge her beyond the briefest flicker of his eyes in her direction. The press. Of course, they were waiting. They were always waiting. The vultures. The parasites. They would be outside now, their cameras lined up like soldiers in formation, their microphones extended in anticipation, their questions already sharpened and ready to be thrown at him like knives. He had built an empire on defying them, had spent years bending the media to his will, playing them like a symphony in which he was both conductor and soloist. But for the first time, he could feel the weight of something slipping, something he did not control. And that was a feeling he could not tolerate. He reached the exit, the dim glow of streetlights casting elongated shadows across the pavement. A surge of movement erupted as soon as the doors pushed open, the gathered reporters snapping to attention, their voices colliding into a chaotic symphony of shouted questions. "Mr. Trump, do you have a response to Caldwell's claims?" "Sir, what do you say to the allegations that Melania has been absent from more than just public events? Is it true that you and the First Lady are living separate lives?" The words slammed into him like waves against a breaking shoreline, relentless, unyielding. The flashes from the cameras strobed in rapid succession, illuminating his face in harsh bursts of artificial light. His jaw tightened. He had navigated scandals before, had danced through the fire of public scrutiny more times than he could count. But this was different. For years, Melania's silence had been an asset, a mystery that the media could speculate on but never truly define. She had existed in the public consciousness as an enigma, a figure of poise and detachment, a presence that neither confirmed nor denied the whispers that surrounded her. But now, the whispers were no longer contained to hushed speculation in op-eds and tabloid columns. Now, they had been spoken aloud, dissected under the unblinking eye of live television, and the world had heard them. He could feel the pressure building, the familiar fire of indignation rising in his chest, his instincts urging him to fight back, to seize control of the narrative before it spiraled further out of his grasp. But there was no easy path forward. Any outright denial would invite further scrutiny. Any attempt at dismissal would only make the question linger longer, the doubts cementing themselves deeper into the public's consciousness. For the briefest moment, hesitation flickered in his mind, a hesitation so foreign, so unlike him, that it made his grip on reality feel unsteady. And then, just as quickly, it was gone. He squared his shoulders, lifted his chin slightly, and let a smirk curve his lips, a carefully controlled expression of amused disdain. "Fake news," he said, the phrase rolling off his tongue with the practiced ease of a man who had wielded it like a shield for years. The reporters pressed forward, voices colliding, the chaos intensifying. "But Mr. Trump, are you denying that the First Lady—" "I'm denying that you people know anything," he interrupted, his voice sharper now, tinged with irritation. "You sit around, make up stories, pretend you've got inside information, and you call it journalism. It's a disgrace." The cameras continue to flash, capturing every twitch, every flicker of emotion that crossed his face. But even as the words left his mouth, even as he delivered them with the force of conviction, something inside him remained unsettled. He had always been able to dismiss attacks before, to steamroll over controversy with sheer force of will. But this felt different, felt like something he could not smother with a tweet or a fiery rally speech. He took a step forward, forcing the reporters to part slightly, his security team closing in around him. He had done what he needed to do, made his statement, set his tone, drawn his line in the sand. But even as he climbed into the waiting SUV, even as the doors shut with a final, heavy thud, the unease remained. In the dim silence of the car, the only sound was the soft hum of the engine, the quiet clicking of a phone being unlocked. One of his aides sat beside him, waiting for instruction, waiting for the inevitable command to begin damage control. But Trump did not speak. He stared at the screen of his phone, his reflection caught in the darkened glass of the window, his own face looking back at him with an unfamiliar weight in his eyes. This was not just another fight with the press. This was not just another political attack to be deflected. This was something he could not control. And for the first time in a very, very long time, that realization sent a slow, quiet tremor through him. The SUV moved smoothly through the darkened streets, its tinted windows sealing Donald Trump away from the storm that raged outside. The relentless flashes of cameras had faded, replaced by the rhythmic pulse of headlights sweeping past, each one casting fleeting shadows across his face. Inside the vehicle, the air was heavy, thick with the unspoken tension that his aides dared not acknowledge. He sat still, staring at his phone, though he wasn't reading the flood of notifications lighting up the screen. His mind churned, grinding through the night's events like a machine struggling to process a malfunction, like gears catching on something they had never encountered before. He had handled scandals before, had weathered more political attacks than most men could endure a lifetime. But this was not like the others. His public image had been built on defiance, on the illusion of invulnerability, on the idea that no accusation, no revelation, no attack could ever truly shake him. He had thrived on being untouchable, on being the man who could never be brought down. But tonight, something had shifted. The question had been asked, and though he had dismissed it, Though he had thrown out his usual defenses, the doubt had been planted. He knew how this worked. He knew that perception shaped reality, that the public would latch onto the silence between his words more than the words themselves. It wasn't the denial that people remembered. It was the hesitation, the flicker of uncertainty, the moment of exposed vulnerability that could never be undone. His fingers tightened around the phone, the screen glowing against his palm as notifications continued to roll in. His advisors would be scrambling now, working on statements, calling friendly news outlets, spinning the narrative into something manageable. But deep down, he knew that the damage was already done. The story was out, and it would not die easily. The car slowed as they approached the private entrance to Trump Tower, the towering glass structure rising like a fortress against the New York skyline. The doors of the SUV unlocked with a soft click, and his lead security officer stepped out first, scanning the area before giving the silent nod. Trump inhaled deeply, smoothing his tie with practiced precision before stepping into the night. The moment his foot hit the pavement, the whispers of the gathered press reached his ears. They were still out there, still waiting, still hunting for another reaction, another sign of weakness to exploit. But he ignored them, keeping his gaze straight ahead as he walked through the glass doors, past the uniformed doorman who straightened instinctively at his presence. Inside, the lobby was quiet, the marble floors gleaming under the dimmed chandelier light. The elevators opened without a sound, swallowing him into their cold, mirrored interior. As the doors slid shut, he caught his own reflection, his shoulders squared, his face unreadable, his expression composed. But something about the image felt wrong, like he was staring at a version of himself that was holding together by sheer force of will. The ride up felt longer than usual, each second stretching unbearably, the quiet hum of the elevator amplifying the storm still raging in his mind. He had planned for many things in his life, had built contingency upon contingency, but he had never truly planned for this, for the moment when control was no longer his to wield. When the doors finally slid open, the penthouse stretched before him, bathed in the soft glow of city lights spilling through the massive windows. The familiar luxury, the gold-trimmed furniture, the polished marble floors, the heavy silk drapes, should have been a comfort, a reminder of the empire he had built. But tonight, it felt hollow, as if the opulence had lost its meaning. He moved through the space with slow, deliberate steps, his shoes clicking against the floor as he passed through the grand living room, past the towering windows that overlooked the endless sprawl of the city below. His eyes flicked toward the far end of the room, toward the double doors that led to the bedroom suite. They were closed. He stopped. For a long moment, he simply stood there, staring at the doors, his mind replaying the journalist's words, the questions that had set this entire night into motion. He had brushed them off, had laughed them away with practiced ease, but now, in the solitude of his own home, they pressed in around him with unbearable weight. He reached for the handle, fingers curling around the cool brass, but he hesitated. The hesitation infuriated him. He was not a man who second-guessed himself, was not a man who paused before acting. And yet, here he stood unmoving. With a sharp breath, he pushed the doors open. The room beyond was dark, illuminated only by the faint city lights filtering through the windows. The bed was made, the sheets untouched, the pillows perfectly arranged. The silence was deafening. She was gone. Not gone in the way that meant she would be back in a few hours. Not gone in the way that meant she had simply stepped out for the evening. The absence in the room felt absolute, felt like something that had been decided long before tonight, something that had been set in motion long before a journalist had dared to say the words out loud. He stepped inside, the weight of realization pressing against his chest like an iron vice. He had spent years crafting the image of his life, had worked tirelessly to control the way the world saw him. But control was an illusion, and illusions always shattered under the weight of truth. He reached for the nightstand, for the phone that rested there, but he already knew. There would be no message, no explanation. His hand hovered over the device for a moment before he withdrew it, his fingers tightening into a fist, his breath slow, measured. He would not give in to the rage, would not let the moment break him. Not yet. But as he turned away, as he walked back toward the empty, gilded halls of his empire, one thought settled into his mind, cold and undeniable. The world had finally seen the cracks in the facade. And no matter how carefully he rebuilt the image, no matter how many statements were issued or a narrative spun, the damage had been done. The truth had caught up, and for the first time, he had nowhere left to run.